The more you try to be liked, the more invisible you become. The more you explain yourself, the less power you hold. You feel it, don't you? That quiet frustration after a conversation where you said too much, gave too much, tried too hard, and somehow ended up feeling smaller. You walk away replaying every sentence in your head, wondering where exactly you lost control of the moment. You thought being open would earn respect. You thought being honest would make people understand you. But instead, something subtle shifted. Their tone changed, their attention drifted, and suddenly, you were no longer the one being listened to. You were the one trying to be validated. You think social power is about showing who you are, proving your worth, making sure no one misunderstands you. But actually, every time you rush to explain, you quietly signal uncertainty. Every time you overclarify, you invite doubt. And most people never realize this. They spend years trapped in this loop, believing the solution is to say more, to do more, to present themselves better, not realizing the problem is the opposite. You don't lack presence, you lack restraint. You don't lack intelligence, you lack control over when to reveal it. And that's why you feel overlooked in rooms where you should be respected. That's why people interrupt you, question you, test you. Because without noticing, you've trained them to. Think about your last real interaction. Not the surface-level ones, but the moments where there was tension, where status was being silently negotiated. Maybe someone challenged you, maybe someone questioned your decision, and instead of holding your ground with silence or calm confidence, you reacted. You explained your reasoning, added more context, tried to make it clear. In your mind, you were being logical, but in their eyes, you were trying to defend your position. And the moment you defend, you are no longer in control. This is the part no one tells you. Social dynamics are not about truth, they are about perception. And perception is shaped in milliseconds, not paragraphs. You don't earn authority by proving it step by step. You project it by how little you feel the need to prove anything at all. That's the shift you've been missing. You've been operating under the assumption that clarity creates respect. But in reality, certainty creates respect. And certainty doesn't speak loudly. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic when misunderstood. It stands still. That's why you've been losing energy in conversations that should have been effortless. You've been trying to control how people see you by managing every detail of your expression, not realizing that true control comes from letting go of that need entirely. Because the moment you try to control perception directly, you lose it. Power is indirect. It's subtle. It's felt, not declared. And right now, you're leaking it in ways you don't even notice. Every unnecessary explanation, every quick reaction, every attempt to smooth things over. You think you're being cooperative, but what you're actually doing is lowering your perceived value. Not because you're weak, but because you're available, too readable, too easy to figure out. And humans don't assign value to what is easily understood. They assign value to what requires effort to decode. That's why you feel like people don't take you seriously, even when you know you're capable. That's why you sometimes feel like you're being overlooked, even when you're doing everything right. Because the rules you're following were designed for comfort, not power. And comfort doesn't command respect, it invites familiarity. And familiarity, unchecked, turns into disregard. So here you are, stuck in this invisible pattern, wondering why things don't shift no matter how much effort you put in. The answer is uncomfortable but simple. You're doing too much. You're giving too much access. You're explaining too much of yourself to people who haven't earned that level of clarity. And every time you do, you chip away at the tension that creates presence. Because presence isn't built by filling space. It's built by controlling it. And right now, you're not controlling it. You're reacting to it. You're letting other people's expectations dictate your responses. You feel the pressure to respond quickly, to justify, to clarify, to make sure everything is understood. And that pressure is exactly what's costing you power. Because powerful people don't operate from pressure. They create it. They let silence stretch just a little longer than comfortable. They let questions hang unanswered for a moment. They don't rush to fix misunderstandings. They observe them. And that difference, that small, almost invisible difference, is everything. It's the line between being perceived as equal and being perceived as someone to follow. You've crossed that line more times than you realize, always on the wrong side, always thinking the solution was to push harder, to explain better, to communicate more clearly. But clarity is not your problem. Your problem is that you're trying to remove all ambiguity. And ambiguity, when controlled, is power. Because when people don't fully understand you, they lean in, they pay attention, they try to interpret. And in that process, they invest mental energy into you. That investment is what creates influence. Not your words, not your logic, your presence. And presence is built in silence, not speech. So if you feel like people don't listen to you the way they should, if you feel like your words don't carry the weight you know they deserve, if you feel like you're constantly being pushed into a position where you have to prove yourself, this is why. You've been trained to believe that more expression equals more respect. But the truth is, more expression often equals more exposure. And exposure, uncontrolled, reduces mystery, reduces tension, reduces power. So the real question isn't, how do you communicate better? It's, how do you stop over-communicating? How do you become comfortable leaving things unsaid? How do you resist the urge to fill every silence, to answer every doubt, to correct every misunderstanding? Because that urge, that impulse, is where your power leaks out. And until you learn to control it, nothing else will change. You can improve your confidence, your skills, your knowledge. But if you still feel the need to constantly explain yourself, you will always be playing from a lower position than you should. That's the uncomfortable truth. And it's the one most people avoid, because it requires letting go of something that feels safe. It requires trusting that you don't need to prove as much as you think you do. It requires sitting in silence when every instinct tells you to speak. And that's not easy, but it's necessary. Because once you understand this, once you truly internalize it, something shifts. You stop chasing validation. You stop trying to control every interaction. You start moving differently, slower, more deliberate, more selective. And people notice, not because you demanded attention, but because you stopped giving it away so easily. And that's where this changes. That's where you start to see the game for what it really is. Not a competition of who can say more, but a test of who can hold more back. Not a battle of words, but a balance of presence. And once you see that, once you feel it, you can't go back to the way you were before. You've been conditioned to believe that being more expressive makes you more respected. But the reality hits differently the moment you start paying attention. The people who hold the most power in any room are rarely the ones speaking the most. And that realization alone should unsettle you, because it directly contradicts everything you've been practicing. You thought clarity earns authority, but what actually earns authority is restraint. And that's the first fracture in your current mindset, because it forces you to confront a pattern you've been repeating without awareness. A pattern where every time you feel tension, you try to dissolve it by explaining. Every time you sense doubt, you rush to eliminate it by clarifying, not realizing that tension is not your enemy, it is your leverage. And the moment you remove it, you remove the very thing that makes people pay attention to you. Human nature is not wired to reward what is fully available. It is wired to pursue what feels just slightly out of reach. And that's why the more you try to be understood, the less interesting you become. Because there is nothing left to decode, nothing left to interpret, nothing left to chase. And your brain, like everyone else's, is addicted to unresolved patterns, to incomplete information, to subtle ambiguity that invites curiosity. Which means when you over-explain, you are not increasing clarity, you are decreasing engagement. And once engagement drops, your perceived value drops with it, even if your actual value hasn't changed at all. Picture a real situation you've lived through, not a hypothetical one, but a moment where someone questioned you in front of others, maybe in a meeting, maybe in a casual conversation, and you felt that immediate internal pressure to respond, to justify, to make sure everyone understood your logic. So you spoke quickly, added context, layered explanation on top of explanation, thinking you were strengthening your position. But what actually happened in that moment was subtle and almost invisible. The more you talked, the more you signaled that you needed acceptance, that you needed agreement. And the moment people sense that need, even unconsciously, the dynamic shifts. Because now you are not the source of certainty, you are reacting to the room, and the room can feel it. Now compare that to someone who faces the same situation but responds differently. They pause, not dramatically, not for effect, but naturally. They let the question sit for a second longer than expected. They respond with fewer words than required, sometimes even with a question instead of an explanation. And then they stop. They don't rush to fill the silence that follows. They let it stretch. And in that space, something happens. People start leaning in, mentally, if not physically, because now they have to work to interpret, to understand, to evaluate. And that effort creates perceived depth. And perceived depth is often mistaken for authority, even if the actual content is identical. This is where the first rule becomes unavoidable. You have to start speaking less than necessary, not as a performance, not as a trick, but as a discipline. Because every extra word you add beyond what is required dilutes the impact of what you're saying. And more importantly, it reveals your internal state. It shows whether you are grounded or whether you are seeking approval. And people are extremely sensitive to that difference, even if they can't articulate it. Which means the way you control your words is the way you control how others position you in their Zehen hierarchy. And if you don't control it, they will do it for you. But speaking less is not just about reducing words. It's about tolerating silence. And that's where most people fail, because silence creates discomfort. It exposes uncertainty. It removes the safety net of constant expression. And in that moment, your instinct will push you to fill the gap, to say something, anything, just to regain control. But that instinct is exactly what you need to resist, because the person who controls silence controls the frame of the interaction, and the frame is where power lives, not in the content, not in the logic, but in the structure of the exchange itself. Then you move deeper into the second layer, the need to be understood. And this is where you've been losing the most without realizing it, because you've been treating misunderstanding as a problem that must be corrected immediately, when in reality, not every misunderstanding reduces your position. Some of them actually strengthen it if you allow them to exist. Because when you rush to correct how people perceive you, you are telling them, indirectly, that their perception matters more than your stability. And that is a subtle but powerful signal of lower status. Whereas when you can express something and then let it stand, without chasing validation, without adjusting your message to fit every listener, you create a different impression, one of self-containment, of certainty that does not depend on agreement. And that kind of certainty is rare, which makes it valuable. Imagine again a simple scenario. Someone misinterprets what you said, slightly twists it, not aggressively, just enough to be inaccurate. And you feel that familiar urge to jump in and fix it, to clarify, to make sure the record is straight. But instead you pause, you let it sit. Maybe you respond with something minimal, or maybe you don't respond at all. And what happens next is critical. People start recalibrating on their own. Because when you don't rush to correct, you create a subtle assumption that your original statement didn't need correction. And that assumption shifts how others process the situation. It forces them to reconsider without you having to push them. And that is influence without effort, which is always more powerful than influence that requires constant input. Then you reach the third rule. And this is where everything either collapses or stabilizes, your emotional reaction. Because no matter how controlled your words are, if your reactions are fast, visible, and predictable, you lose the advantage. Because reactions reveal triggers, and triggers reveal points of control. And once someone identifies what moves you, they can move you again, intentionally or not, which means your consistency is broken. And without consistency, there is no perceived strength. Only moments of strength that can't be relied on. You've experienced this before, when someone says something that hits a nerve, and before you can even think, your body responds, your tone shifts, your pace changes, your words come faster, sharper, more defensive, and in that moment, the interaction is no longer under your control. It is under the control of your reaction, and everyone in the room can feel it. Even if they don't consciously analyze it, they register the shift, and that registration changes how they engage with you moving forward. Now contrast that with controlled response, not suppression, not pretending, but actual control, where the stimulus hits and you absorb it without immediate output. You give yourself space, even a second, even half a second, and in that space, you choose your response instead of reacting automatically. And that choice is what creates unpredictability. And unpredictability, when paired with calm, creates a sense of depth that people instinctively respect, because they can't easily map you, they can't easily predict you, and what cannot be predicted cannot be easily controlled. All of these rules connect back to a single underlying mechanism: perception management through absence rather than presence. You are not adding more to gain power, you are removing what weakens it. And what weakens it is excess. Excess words, excess explanations, excess reactions. And the discipline is not in learning something new, it's in unlearning the compulsion to overgive, overshow, overcorrect. Because every time you hold back, not randomly but intentionally, you create a small gap. And in that gap, other people project meaning. They fill it with their assumptions, their interpretations. And if you've structured your behavior correctly, those projections will tend to favor strength over weakness, depth over simplicity, control over chaos. This is why repeating the concept from different angles matters, because it's not enough to understand it once. You have to see it in multiple contexts until it becomes automatic. Until the moment you feel the urge to explain, you recognize it as a signal, not as a command. Until the moment you feel the urge to react, you see it as a choice point, not as an inevitability. And that repetition builds a new pattern, one where you are no longer driven by the need to manage every perception in real time, but by the ability to let perception form around you with minimal interference. And when you reach that point, interactions change, not dramatically on the surface, but fundamentally underneath. People start giving you more space, more attention, more weight, not because you demanded it, but because you stopped diluting it. And that's the shift you've been missing. Not more effort, but more control. Not more expression, but more precision. Not more visibility, but more intentional invisibility at the right moments. Because power, real social power, is not loud, it is contained. And the more contained you become, the more it expands in the eyes of others. Everything comes down to this: not confidence, not intelligence, not even experience, but control. Control over what you reveal, control over what you hold back, control over the invisible signals you send in every interaction. Because whether you notice it or not, people are constantly measuring you, not by your words alone, but by the space around your words, by the pauses, by the restraint, by the absence of unnecessary reaction. And if there is one shift you need to lock into your mind, it's this: power is not something you add, it's something you stop leaking. You've spent years thinking you needed to become more, say more, prove more. But the real transformation begins when you start removing the excess, when you stop over-explaining, stop overreacting, stop over-participating in dynamics that don't deserve your full presence. Because every time you do less with intention, you actually create more impact. And that contradiction is what separates those who are constantly chasing attention from those who naturally command it. If you want presence, you must embrace silence. Not awkward silence, not forced silence, but controlled silence. The kind that comes from knowing you don't need to fill every gap to maintain your position. The kind that allows you to sit in a moment without rushing to resolve it. Because unresolved moments create tension, and tension is what holds attention. And attention, when sustained, turns into influence. So instead of asking yourself what to say next, start asking yourself whether anything needs to be said at all. Because often the most powerful move is not speaking, it's allowing others to sit with what's already been said. Allowing your words to echo instead of being buried under more words. If you want influence, you must release the need to be understood, completely, fully, immediately. Because that need is what drives you to over-communicate, to adjust yourself constantly based on how others respond. And in doing so, you lose your center, you lose your stability, you become reactive instead of grounded. And once that happens, your influence becomes fragile, dependent on approval rather than rooted in certainty. But when you let go of that need, when you can express something and leave it there without chasing agreement, you create a different kind of gravity. One where people come to you for clarity instead of you chasing them for validation. And that shift alone changes how you are perceived in ways that no amount of explanation ever could. If you want power, real power, you must become comfortable being unreadable to a certain degree. Not completely closed off, not disconnected, but not fully transparent either. Because full transparency removes all tension, and without tension, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to explore, nothing to respect. Whereas controlled ambiguity creates depth, it creates curiosity. It creates a sense that there is more beneath the surface, and people are naturally drawn to that. They lean in, they pay attention, they try to understand. And in that process, They assign value to you without you having to demand it. And that is the kind of power that sustains itself. Most people will never understand this, not because it's complicated, but because it goes against their instincts. It requires them to sit in discomfort, to resist the urge to explain, to tolerate being misunderstood for a moment, to allow silence to exist without filling it. And those things feel unnatural at first. They feel like you're losing control, when in reality you're gaining it. But because the discomfort is immediate and the results are subtle, most people give up before they ever see the shift. They go back to what feels safe, what feels familiar, talking more, explaining more, reacting faster, and they stay stuck in the same patterns, wondering why nothing changes. You don't need more techniques. You don't need more lines to say. You don't need a better script. What you need is discipline. The discipline to pause when you want to react. The discipline to stay silent when you want to fill the gap. The discipline to leave things unsaid when you feel the urge to clarify. Because those moments, those small decisions, are where your position is actually defined. Not in the big speeches, not in the obvious moves, but in the micro behaviors that most people ignore. And once you start controlling those, everything else begins to align naturally. You'll notice that people interrupt you less, not because you demanded respect, but because your words carry more weight when you use fewer of them. You'll notice that people pay closer attention, not because you ask them to, but because you've created space that invites focus. You'll notice that you feel less drained after interactions, because you're no longer trying to manage every perception in real time. You're allowing things to unfold without constant interference. And that ease, that lack of strain, becomes part of your presence. It signals that you are not dependent on the outcome of every interaction, and that independence is interpreted as strength. But this only works if it's real, if it's grounded, if it's not a performance, because people can sense forced behavior just as easily as they can sense insecurity. So this is not about pretending to be calm, it's about becoming calm. Not about acting mysterious, but about being selective. Not about suppressing yourself, but about refining when and how you express yourself. Because suppression creates tension inside you, while control creates tension around you. And those are two completely different things. One weakens you, the other strengthens your position. And here's the part that matters most, the part that you can't ignore if you actually want this to work: consistency. Because doing this once or twice won't change anything. You can't be controlled one moment and reactive the next. You can't be silent in one conversation and over-explaining in another. Because inconsistency breaks the perception you're trying to build. It makes you unpredictable in the wrong way. Not in a way that creates intrigue, but in a way that creates doubt. So you have to commit to this as a baseline, not as a tactic, not as something you turn on when you remember, but as a default way of operating. And that takes time. It takes awareness. It takes catching yourself in the act, noticing when you're about to over-explain, when you're about to react, when you're about to give more than necessary, and choosing differently in that moment. Most people won't do this. They'll hear it, maybe even agree with it, but they won't apply it consistently enough to see results. And that's why they stay where they are, because the gap between knowing and doing is where everything is decided. And closing that gap requires effort that most people are not willing to sustain. So if you actually want to shift how you are perceived, how you are treated, how much influence you have in any environment, you have to internalize this at a deeper level. You have to stop looking for external validation of your behavior and start measuring yourself by your ability to maintain control under pressure. Because pressure is where your true patterns reveal themselves, not when everything is easy, but when you are challenged, when you are questioned, when you are pushed. And in those moments, you either fall back into old habits or you reinforce the new ones. And every time you reinforce them, you strengthen your position, not just in that interaction, but in every interaction that follows. So watch this again, not as information, but as a mirror. Pay attention to where you recognize yourself, where you see your own patterns, your own habits, your own impulses. Because awareness is the first step, but it means nothing without action. And action here is not loud. It's not visible. It's quiet, controlled, almost invisible to everyone except you. And that's exactly why it works. Because the less obvious it is, the more powerful it becomes. And once you start moving this way, once you start operating with this level of control, you'll notice something shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, steadily. And then all at once, you'll realize that you're no longer chasing attention. You're no longer trying to prove yourself. You're no longer reacting to every signal around you. Instead, you're setting the tone. You're holding the frame. You're creating the space in which others move. And that is where real power begins. Not when people hear you, but when they feel you, even when you say nothing at all.